This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Final Fantasy by using my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are in the very early stages of Final Fantasy Limited. I drafted it about 4 times during the early access event. There should be a couple of draft videos up. I did do kind of wacky things in them, so they're not really like... They're videos where the message I think would be do as I say and not as I do. Because I tried to force some silly stuff, you know, like playing the big god, who you can really only play in a mono black deck, and stuff like that. But, you know, there is content for this format up. And as usual, in this very early stage of the format, I like to do what is kind of a Cliff's Notes of my set review, where I look at the best commons and uncommons in each color, give you my picks for what those are. And this is a worthwhile thing to know, because commons and uncommons are the most important part of your deck, or at least they make up the majority of your deck. So let's dive in with a look at the best commons and uncommons in Final Fantasy, how I feel about them right now. So let's start with White. I think White's third best common is actually White Mage's Staff. This is a funny one because I managed to leave it out of my set review. It's been a while since I missed a card, but I somehow did, and it didn't show up in my video. I did leave a comment where I talked about how I felt about it, but I still probably wouldn't have had it number 3. I was thinking it was an okay common, but this is one card that has moved up for me after playing a few drafts in the format, and I probably should have thought of it more highly to begin with. And this is because it's like a really good sort of glue common that works with all of the different white decks really well. So, you know, red-white likes equipment, check. Blue-white likes artifacts, check. And black-white likes to play things that make more than one permanent for it to sacrifice for value. Check. And it's also just an okay 2-drop. I mean, you know, in a vacuum, I thought it was going to be a solid 2-drop, right? It's just an okay card to begin with. But then when you throw in the fact that it's synergistic with 3 white strategies, it gets to be even better. And, you know, there are some life gain payoffs at higher rarities, and it's one of the better ways to get life gain on the board early and repeatable in the format. So sometimes you can even go off with that sort of thing, thanks to the staff. But most of its value, I think, comes from how well it fits into multiple white decks in the format. And I think the second best white common is Summon Choco-Mog. So this is a 3-mana 3/1 that does +1/+0 to your whole board multiple times, you know, which is pretty impressive. Oftentimes it comes down on turn 3 and gives you attacks you didn't have, or makes those attacks better if you did have them. And then the buff continues to be kind of a problem for your opponent on subsequent turns. And like, I think some people who were looking at the saga creatures going into the format had kind of low opinions about them because they didn't love that they don't stay around, right? They eventually get sacrificed. They have an expiration date. But the ones, especially with 4 chapters, they all play pretty well. I mean, in your typical game of Limited, how often does your 3-mana 3/3 survive for like 3 turns anyway, right? I mean, if you can trade it off after getting value out of it, it feels pretty good. It is true that your opponent, you know, can kind of wait for it to get removed on some board states, but while this is in play, it's usually delivering value that makes a difference. And so it has played pretty well. You know, the white can go pretty wide in this format, so Summon Choco-Mog is pretty good. And then number 1 for white is White Aura Sight, which, you know, probably pretty obvious. It is more expensive than your typical Oblivion Ring-like effect, but it does have 2 upsides, especially in this set that Oblivion Ring doesn't have. One of them is that it's an artifact, and that matters. And the other is that it can tap for mana, which is pretty amazing. Being able to play this and ramp your mana and remove something is pretty good. And you know, there are ways to destroy it. That downside is always there, but this kind of removal always works really, really well in Limited, and this is a really nice one because of the mana it gives you. All right, at Uncommon, I kind of want to talk about 2 cards. So first, let's talk about Battle Menu. This thing is just like such a good removal spell. 2 mana to destroy a big thing is a pretty good deal. And then it has these other modes that are less good. You're not going to feel as efficient about them. But the fact that this is such an efficient removal spell for big creatures, and then has these other modes, like if you really need a 2-drop, it can do it. If your opponent tries to kill a creature with a damaging effect and you want to save it, you can do it. If you really need to gain life because you're dead otherwise, you can do it. So having this really good removal spell that also has all of these other modes, even as uninteresting as they are, and underpowered really for the amount of mana you're spending as they are, means that this is just a really great removal spell. So I like Battle Menu a lot, but I do think there's one uncommon that is better than Battle Menu in uncommon, at least one, and that is Delivery Moogle. This comes with a caveat though, because Delivery Moogle does need something to search up, like a White Mage's Staff. When you cast it, it lets you tutor up an artifact with mana value 2 or less. So in a lot of the decks in the format, this is kind of like White Mage's Staff, and I did like this one in the set review. It ends up just being able to grab stuff in like all the white decks. Again, blue-white likes artifacts more broadly, red-white likes equipment, and black-white likes artifacts a reasonable amount too because it likes to sacrifice them. So this ends up becoming a pretty powerful 2-for-1. I mean, just searching up White Mage's Staff feels great, right? And it's not like that's a busted card, but you're getting a real card to play on your next turn. And Delivery Moogle definitely delivers there. I mean, you end up being able to generate a 2-for-1. And 4 mana 3/2 flyer isn't good by today's standards, but when that's what you're getting on board while tutoring up something else, it's good enough. I mean, it's not the kind of card your opponent can ignore entirely. It does die to really cheap removal, but you get a 2-for-1, so it's not a disaster. And that's like a really good litmus test in today's limited, especially when you're spending like 3 or more mana. When you ask yourself, if my opponent spends 1 or 2 mana to kill this, and can they kill it, first of all, for 1 or 2 mana, and second of all, how much does it hurt? And with Delivery Moogle, it's like, okay, it's not a big deal. I already drew a card off of it. And that's always a good sign. So I think the Moogle, I think of it as sort of a build around, but it may just slot into every white deck. And if it does, it is just better than Battle Menu. Battle Menu has nice flexibility and it can occasionally generate a 2-for-1, but Delivery Moogle definitely can. All right, let's move to blue now, where I think the third best common is Ice Magic. This card always, when you spend 4 for this, is a card that we play in like every limited format. It's not an amazing removal spell, but it's one you play one of a lot, and it lets you trade 1-for-1 with your opponent and occasionally generate big blowouts because they try to use a trick or an aura or something. And then this also has 2 other modes that can be nice. The 2-mana mode is one you can use even earlier if your opponent presents a situation where you really need to bounce something. And then you have the big mana mode, which, is kind of funny to me because as far as an upgrade over the 4-mana mode, it is like kind of a wash. I don't think it's always necessarily better. But if sometimes you would rather shuffle the card in than make your opponent draw it again. Yeah, I mean, it does all of that stuff. Plus, in the blue-red deck, which cares about mana value 4 or greater, if you cast it for the second or third mode, it's going to trigger those things. And there are a few triggers for 8, and it can also do that. But that part of the card isn't that relevant. But it is a nice removal spell. It does some nice work. It's a nice interactive card that works with synergy in the format, too. I think blue's second best common is Stuck in Summoner's Sanctum. We see this card also a lot in blue these days. 3 mana to tap a creature down and take away all of its abilities. This one has flash, which is great. So occasionally you can produce blowouts with it too, although not as well as conventional removal. It's not always good against opponents who can sack stuff for value and stuff like that, but it does basically remove anything, for 3 mana, and it does a really good job there. And then I think blue's best common is Dragoon's Wyvern. This is often blue's best common, or white. Sometimes white gets this kind of card, but the card where you get like a reasonably efficient creature that also makes a 1/1 token is just always good and limited. Dragoon's Wyvern, 3 mana, 2/1 flyer, get a 1/1. That's just an excellent rate for what you're getting out of it. Because it adds so much to the board, I mean, it's the kind of card that even feels good if you're behind and you cast it because you get 2 bodies. It's the kind of card that's really good when you play it on 3. You can pressure them in the sky without giving up anything on the ground. And, another nice litmus test to think about is, how many of these would I play in my deck? Is there such a thing as too many? And with Dragoon's Wyvern, I don't think there is. I think you would, if you draft 6 of them, which is possible, it's a common. I had a deck where I drafted 4, and it was pretty nice. But, you can draft a bunch of them, and you would just play all of them because there's just not a situation where Dragoon's Wyvern is bad. You know, it may not have the highest ceiling in the world, but it's just very rarely a bad card, a card that doesn't do anything because it adds so much to the board for its cost. It just ends up being really good. It is interesting in that it doesn't have any significant synergy in the set. You know, it's not an artifact, it's not a spell, you know, it's not in a color where you can take advantage of the extra bodies for the most part, but sometimes that's a good thing. I mean, just having a card that's good in every blue deck makes it better as a higher pick, and it is really strong. All right, next let's look at Quistis Trape. I think this is the best uncommon in blue. 3 mana, 3/2, lets you flashback a spell in either graveyard is just great. I mean, it's going to generate a 2-for-1. Now, there is a downside with Quistis Trape, and I talked about it in the set review, and that is that sometimes you just have to run out of 3-drop, and, you know, this isn't the greatest one, but, like, you can look at that as upside in a way. Look at Quistis Trape as like a more expensive card almost that lets you cast either yours or your opponent's best instant or sorcery in the graveyard, because that's what it does. I mean, even if you're casting it like you're spending 3, there's a good chance you can get a good spell for 2 mana. And it, you know, it does mean it's not a card you run out early, but the 2-for-1 value there is just too much to overcome, even for like a really good blue removal spell, or which is also, I think, a really good uncommon, Sleep Magic. I think Quistis Trape is just better because the ceiling is just so high in terms of letting you flash something back, more or less. And yeah, the 2-for-1 is going to feel really good. All right, let's move to black now. I think the third best black common is Heck Dies. We see this card just be good in every format, like even in a vacuum. 2 mana, 1/1, make your opponent discard is something that you always play. You know, it's not a common that necessarily generates a 2-for-1, since a 1/1 is as underwhelming as it is. But like, it makes your opponent's X1s not want to attack because you've already taken a card away from them, and that means they get 2-for-1 if they attack into it. And it is especially good, and probably at its best, in the black-white deck, which can sacrifice it for value, sometimes giving you a legitimate 2-for-1 if the sacrifice thing is strong enough. So, you know, it's just a great thing to run out on turn 2. Any opening hand you have in this format where you're like, oh, I have a Heck Dies on turn 2, you feel pretty good about it. I mean, it's just a play that is a quality play because it takes a card away from your opponent immediately, really disrupts them. You know, even when they discard a land, I mean, we've all been there. We discarded a land and we're like, I have plenty of lands, but then you miss your land drop because you discarded a land to this thing. And it's still pretty good late. I mean, people usually have 1 or 2 cards in their hand that Heck Dies can get rid of. So, you know, it's a very nice common. I think the second best black common is Sephiroth's Intervention. So you do overpay a little bit for this. It's kind of like White Auracite. You know, spending 4 to kill a creature isn't great, but gaining life at the same time is just such a big deal. Like, that's a pretty big swing. Kill your opponent's best creature, gain 2 life, really alters the game in your favor significantly more than just destroy target creature does. Especially, this spell's main problem is that you overpay sometimes. You have to kill a 3-drop with it, and that still isn't going to feel great, but because you gain 2 life, you can make up for being inefficient with your mana to a degree. So it's a good removal spell. It's not insane, but, you know, I think it is black's second best common. I will say I think black is super deep at common because you've also got Undercity Dire Rat, 2 mana 2/2 that dies into a treasure. You've got Shinra Reinforcements, which is going to, I think, help buoy a lot of the graveyard decks in the format. You've got Cornered by Black Mages, which is a nice edict. If it was too generic in a black to cast that thing, I think it would have been here over Sephiroth's Intervention, but I do think double black is a significant enough difference in limited, especially on an edict effect, because you want to cast those as soon as you can usually, and you just can't always when it has double black in the cost. So yeah, I mean, and I'm not even talking about some other commons that I could see being in the conversation. Black is super deep at common. That said, I think it's pretty clear what black's best common is, and that is Vane's Treachery. The base form of this card, 2 mana, 4 -2/2. It's a card you would play anyway. Wouldn't be in the top 3 commons for black, but it would be a playable common, a nice, solid one at least. But then it comes with a kicker that just turns it into a removal spell that kills almost everything. And sure, you have to give something up, but if you're giving up your Heck Dies or a treasure token to make it into -6/6, you don't really care. You know, you're getting the value very easily. And it's an instant, it can blow people out in a big way. It's just a very powerful removal spell. I think black's also pretty deep at uncommon. I think my pick in the end for best black uncommon, though, is Side Quest Hunt the Mark. So 5 mana to destroy a creature isn't great, but it does also give you a treasure. So it's actually a pretty swingy play sometimes to cast Side Quest Hunt the Mark, kill their best creature, get a treasure. Next turn, you can potentially ramp into something you couldn't play before thanks to that treasure. But what really makes the side quest great is the fact that it can transform. And sure, it takes a little while, it needs 3 treasure, but if you are paying 5 mana for this huge creature that destroys target creature, like, that's an incredible play. And I think that happens with this card more than we think it will, more than you might think it will, because there are common ways to make treasure. It doesn't need to have only its own treasure. If you're playing the Dire Rat that I just mentioned, or Namazu Trader, both commons in black, you have a pretty good chance at having some other treasure around. Furthermore, it can just fuel itself, because once you get that first treasure, anytime you attack your opponent, they have to consider what to do because they might give you a treasure, in which case they're getting closer to having to deal with a huge creature that you didn't pay anything for. So overall, it just ends up being, I think, a really strong card. It is the kind of card that will fall off if the format is incredibly fast, and if that's true, something like Overkill will be better, a cheaper removal spell that is better the turn you cast it by a lot, but doesn't have this long game plan where it turns into a legit win condition the way Side Quest Hunt the Mark can. All right, let's move to red now. I think the third best common in red is Call the Mountain Chocobo. So 4 mana to put a 2/2 into play with upside. You know, it's got that landfall upside all the Chocobo tokens have. And draw a mountain is just pretty sweet. Like, that's just a really good 2-for-1. It's a nice value play. You can trade off the 2/2 if you have to, and there's a good chance it can at that early stage of the game. But then there are a number of synergy things going on here that help Call the Mountain Chocobo be even better. One of them is just the fact that it's a 4 mana spell for the blue-red deck, so it'll trigger that stuff. That deck also really happy to make sure it hits its 5th land because it likes casting expensive things. And it's also a card that helps you set up landfall, which red-green cares about. So it's this really good value play in addition to having some synergy in the format. And I didn't even mention it had flashback. I think in my ideal world, Call the Mountain Chocobo ends up being even better than I think. Ends up being like number 1. And it is true. It has the 2-for-1 potential that the other 2 red commons I'm about to talk about don't have. But the other 2 are just so efficient at what they do that it's pretty hard for me not to include them higher. For example, there's Suplex, which is 2 mana for a sorcery that does 3 to a creature or can exile an artifact. It also exiles a creature if it kills it. That just ends up trading up a huge chunk of the time. Exiling stuff really matters these days with the proliferation of graveyard triggers and graveyard nonsense and limited. So that ends up really mattering. Being able to hit artifacts cheaply certainly has its place in the format too. It is sorcery speed, but, you know, it does do the job pretty efficiently. And then the best red common is Thunder Magic. This is Shock that can only hit a creature as a baseline, which probably would have been good enough for number 3 on the list of best red commons in the set. So that tells you something. It still would have been in this video, but then it scales, and that's what really makes it great. Now, the other modes aren't efficient, but don't get hung up on that. The point is that you have this removal spell that's great early and later in the game can still kill anything. Like, that's the way to look at it. And that is just an incredibly powerful thing to have. And that's what makes it so good. Like I said, you know, Thunder Magic and Suplex, not normally going to create 2-for-1s. Thunder Magic has more of a potential to because it's an instant. Suplex doesn't, but, you know, it's super efficient overall. I think red looks pretty good at common in general because all 3 of these are commons I would consider first picking, and that is saying something. On the other hand, I don't think red's that deep at uncommon. For me, I think Samurai's Katana is probably the best uncommon. Its baseline is 3 mana, 3/3 with trample and haste. Feels great on turn 3, and that's a body that's relevant all game long too. But then you throw in the fact it's a non-creature spell for black-red, it's an equipment for red-white, and then it's just got a really good rate, and then later in the game you can move it to something else to make it more of a threat. all of that just ends up making the katana really, really good. You know, as much as I love chocobos, I hope that Choco Comet ends up being the best red uncommon. And I do think it's pretty good. It's basically, you know, a 2/2 that does X, a 2-mana 2/2 that does X to any target and then puts a body in play. But I feel like it's a little too inefficient, even with getting a body in play, for it to be incredible. It's close though. You know, the idea of spending 5 to kill a 3/3 and get a 2/2 with upside is pretty good, for example. And it does have that 2-for-1 potential. But I think there are going to be enough games where it's not efficient enough for you to feel like it's an amazing uncommon. So for me, it's the katana in the end. All right, now let's move to green, where I think the third best common is Gubu Gardener. So we see 2-mana 1/3 that taps for green be a really good common. We've seen that in the past, and I don't see that changing here. Green decks, as usual, are pretty interested in ramping. Both red-green and blue-green especially are very into ramping their mana, but so is like any deck. Like if you can run this 1/3 out on turn 2 and play a 4-drop on turn 3, you're going to be in a really good spot. So it's a nice way to get your mana going. And honestly, as good as Llanowar Elves is, and I would take Llanowar Elves over Gubu Gardener, of course, it does have one advantage over cheaper mana dorks, and that is that its body is way more relevant when you draw it late. Like a 1/3 actually matters, a 1/1 rarely does. I think the second best green common is Chocobo Kick. So this is the usual Rabid Bite-like effect. It is a sorcery, and that card already is a good common. It would probably be number 3 here in terms of the best green commons if that's how it worked. But it's better than that because it also has kicker, and it's a kicker you can almost literally always play. You can almost always return a land you control to its owner's hand. You don't always want to because you don't want to go behind on mana, right? But you can, and oftentimes going down a land drop to kill your opponent's best creature, and especially if it's a blocker, and get it out of the way, is worth it anyway. And in the late game, you're just always going to kick it and not really care. It can even help you rebuy landfall. So, you know, that is upside there too. So this has a solid baseline and then a really big upside where your creatures can kill almost anything in the late game because you can kick it. And I think green's best common is Summon Fat Chocobo. It's pretty funny that that's its name. But yeah, I mean, this starts out as a 5-mana 4/4 that makes a 2/2. That is a great card. And if it ended there, it would be like a B, just because the rate is so good. The rest of the card has a mix of upside and downside. The downside is the expiration date on your 4/4. The upside is that your creatures are all going to have trample on the next turn and the turn after that and the turn after that if it's still around. And you can't always take advantage of that, but because you have a big 4/4 in play and a 2/2 that's probably attacking as a 3/2, there are actually a lot of boards where trample matters. And it's good if you get it early, like running this out on 5 because you need 2 bodies and you need to catch up is great. Getting it late is good because you can use the 2 bodies, and then the trample part is even better. So Summon Fat Chocobo is a really, really good common. It wouldn't shock me if it ends up being the best common in the set, but we'll have to see. And I think green's best uncommon, which might also be the best uncommon in the set, is Torgal, a Fine Hound. 2-mana, 2/2, can tap for 1 mana of any color. If we stop there, it's in the conversation for best uncommon. But on top of that, it also happens to put a +1/+1 counter on humans that enter the battlefield. This set has a ton of humans, and the fact that Torgal ramps your mana makes it more likely you have access to more humans in your hand. So it's also going to make your creatures better. It ramps your mana, it fixes your mana. It's a 2-mana 2/2. There's nothing not to like, about Torgal, a Fine Hound. And I do think, green has another really good uncommon in Summon Fenrir, which can ramp your mana and then give you a bunch of other value. I do think Torgal beats it out. I mean, it's kind of like a worse Torgal in a lot of ways. Both of them ramp your mana. Both of them can give you counters, and then the third mode on Fenrir can draw you a card, but then Fenrir's gone, whereas Torgal just sits around, so, and continues to do his thing. And his thing continues to be relevant because of the counters. So overall, it looks like a really good uncommon to me, even outclassing Summon Fenrir. All right, that will do it for this video. In the next video, I will give you my early thoughts on the format after I've drafted the format 10 or 15 times or so, what I think is working, what's not working. If you want to make sure you see that video, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to watch my set review or my draft videos for this format, you should check out the playlist that'll be on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.